Welcome back to another episode of Shift with Elena. In this conversation, I chat with Stephen Huerta. He's a co-host of the Modern People Leader podcast, and we dive into his remarkable career from starting in his HR roles in companies like Ernst and Young and Goldman Sachs to then building an HR tech. And then we really dove into the topic of modern people leader. What does that mean for us today with all the AI that's happening, with everything, the transformation that we're going to be going through, right? And how soon should we expect this transformation? You'll be surprised to hear some of the numbers that he mentioned. We explore the realities that HR leaders face today, how organizations can and must rethink their approach to change, and why the future of work demands collaboration between HR and IT like never before. So if you're in the space, or if you're interested in HR tech, or just trying to understand what is the future of work going to require from you as a leader in this space, this episode is definitely for you. So check it out. As always, like, subscribe, comment, and come back for more. Stephen, welcome to the Shift podcast.
Hi, Elena. How you doing?
I'm
You
doing
good today?
well. Yeah, I'm really excited to chat with you because I've been, as before we start recording, I said like there's some people in my world, just like not one podcasters, of course, but also just like talent development professional entrepreneurs that are in my space that I really want to chat to, and so with. And you've been on that list for a while, so thank you for making the time. I'm very excited to dive into your career story, the things that you're building, your podcast journey, and just to get to know you a little bit more and share you with my audience.
Awesome. Yeah, the tables have turned, and usually I'm interviewing, so it'll be fun to be interviewed. So I'm looking forward to
Yeah.
it.
I always like to put other podcasters on the spot because it's like now you get to experience being a guest. Um, so, Stephen, tell us a little bit more about your journey from being an HR practitioner, at kind of large organizations to then, co-founding a couple of things and then also hosting Modern People Leader podcast. Tell me your career story. You can go back as far back as you want to, and as close to today as possible.
Well, I think the first thing I'll share is that I have been in this field for a long time, and a lot of people think that Daniel, my co-host, so the Modern People Leader, is the podcast that I run. I co-hosted it with my first cousin once removed, Daniel. A lot of people think we're brothers. We're not. We're cousins, and because of that, I'm a lot older, and I only share that because a lot of times people are surprised to hear that I have been in this field for 25 years. And so I have done quite a bit in those 25 years. Important part of my story is that my parents are Hispanic, Mexican American, and I was raised in Texas. My dad was the youngest of 12 kids. He was the only one that graduated, well, one of two that graduated from high school, and the only one that graduated from college. And, that's important because, I'm two generations away from migrant workers, like field workers. My dad's family, they would pick cotton, watermelons, whatever was in season, and I've been very fortunate to not live that life. I have been very lucky, and I think I have worked really hard. But my journey, really started in college. I went to University of Texas at Austin, and I was an economics major with a finance minor. And I thought I wanted to be in business. HR was not on my radar whatsoever. The summer before I graduated, my family helped me get an internship with the Texas State Controller. And I thought, oh, cool, finance. Like, this is the department that handles, the state's finances. So that'll like apply to my major and my degree. And when I started the job, I realized, wow, this is very different. And in fact, it was payroll. And so every month, the state of Texas, if you don't pay your child support, if you haven't paid your taxes, and you're a state employee, the state will withhold your wages. So they will hold your wages. And back then, so this is 1998, 99. I would go into these like secured safes like a big vault, and every morning there would be a list of people that could or were taken off the list. They could receive their paychecks, and there was a bunch of paychecks that were being withheld from people for whatever reason. And every day I would go in manual files, and I would look up I would file away the paychecks, and I would distribute those that were being released. And so that was like payroll. It wasn't at all what I thought it would be. It was payroll related. And so fast forward, to 2000, I graduate. Super excited at the time. The dot-com bubble was building and building. This is the era of gardens.com, pets.com. Everyone, the VCs thought that these companies were going to grow and grow and grow. Turns out that, only some of them would pan out. And the market collapsed. And so in 2000, in January 2000, when I entered the workforce, it was a really tough job market, kind of similar to but different to today, where there was a technology shift happening. Companies were hesitant to bring on headcount, and so I took the best offer I had, Elena, and that was HR consulting. International HR consulting is, I think, how they sold it with Ernst and Young. And that today, I think it would be known as global mobility or talent mobility.
Mm.
And so I grew up in this really obscure part of HR, having been recruited, from with a really kind of obscure, degree into HR. And as soon as I joined, I realized like HR, this was a space that I would be able it was like a love hate. On one hand, I loved that there was so much opportunity. I hated that things were so administrative, that things were highly manual, and so I think that really kicked me off, in the early days with this passion to innovate, to find new ways, to find better ways of doing the work that we do. Um, I quickly went from being a mobility generalist to being a compensation analyst to being an implementation specialist. And what that meant was I got to do sales, and I got to bring on new clients. And turns out I was pretty good with demoing and sales. And I was staffed on a big engagement for a huge investment bank, Goldman Sachs, and Ernst and Young won the contract. And as part of winning the contract, the Goldman Sachs team was going to need some people on site to help with the implementation. And they liked me. They were like, "Who's the guy that did the demo? We want him on our account." So so now this is around 2004, 2005. Ernst and Young moves me to New York. I'm working on site at Goldman Sachs. And after a year working on site, I don't even think I saw my office in Times Square at Ernst and Young, because I was staffed at the client side. And after a year on site, I was working up my manager was in my Goldman Sachs manager was in London, and I would go every quarter to give updates on my projects. And on one of the trips back, I shared a cab with the managing director that oversaw total rewards. So that's compensation and benefits. And on the cab ride, he was just like asking me a lot of questions. This is a guy named Rich Stingy. He's now CHRO. And one of the questions he asked me was like, "Stephen, like, where do you see your career going?" And I remember this is probably a 24, 25-year-old me, super brazen, um, thought that I could, that I could accomplish anything. And I remember him telling him, I want to be a partner at Ernst and Young. And when we got to Heathrow, we were at Goldman's Fleet Street office. And when we got to Heathrow, that was probably like 45-minute conversation. He says, "Would you be interested in a job at Goldman Sachs?" And I said, "Of course." Yes, I would be. And that's how I got my second job. And I worked at Goldman for almost 7 years. And that's really where I cut my teeth as an HR practitioner. I worked in a number of functions, executive comp, global mobility, data security, I worked on an HR M&A team for 2 years. And I think that's probably most relevant to this story, because it was in those 2 years as in HR M&A that I realized two important things. I thought, given my background, economics major, I thought I wanted to be an investment banker. And when I started working on deals, I realized I hated it. That just wasn't the best use of my skill set. But I was fascinated by the people that had created the deal that got Goldman to invest and then exited. And I thought, how do I become that? Like, at UT, there was no major for entrepreneurship. And so I thought I needed to go get my MBA. Turns out my network disagreed with that. And the advice I got was like, hey, Steven, just like plan out, the rest of your career at Goldman and, and think about how you can segue that into entrepreneurship. And for me, what that looked like was I first needed to move back to Texas because I worked for Goldman in New York, and in 2009 I moved back to Texas. I I did that through a Goldman Sachs subsidiary called Archon Group. They were real estate management, and I was head of HR technology at Archon and diversity officer. And so I did that for 2 years, and it in that during that tenure, Goldman Sachs had decided to take this fully owned subsidiary and turn it into the Goldman Sachs Dallas office. And through that, there was reductions in force. My name wasn't on the list of these reductions in force, but I negotiated a package and used that package to be my seed capital for my first business. And that was in 2011 is when I finally left the firm. And in 2012, so if you consider like 25 years in HR, first half I was an HR practitioner. In 2012, I started my first business. And for the last 12, 13 years, I've now been an entrepreneur targeting HR. My first business was a services company. I was about, I don't know, 8 years too early, Elena, on fractional HR. Today, that's like everywhere you can be super successful. Back then, it was pretty radical. But I was able to grow that to the point where I realized, okay, I believe in myself as an entrepreneur. I think I can do this. However, SAS was now ruling all of the airwaves and the news and publicity. And I wanted to give it launching an HR tech startup, give that a chance. And so in 2014, I decided to shut my consulting firm down. 6 months later, I met through a friend of a friend, met an entrepreneur in Austin, Texas. I was living in Dallas, who asked me to pitch him on, my biggest lessons learned as an entrepreneur. I shared with him a few things, and one of which was an idea I had for a culture app. And within a month of that conversation, 6 months after I shut my first business down, I had a commitment to invest $500,000 into what would become my second business, Workify, which was an engagement survey company. That was more successful. I got that business to 1.5 million in ARR. We never raised any venture funding, and that was kind of the problem. Is when you have competitors like Glint, Culture Amp, Lattice, all having raised hundreds of millions of dollars, it over time just becomes impossible to compete. And so, around 2020, we were already looking to sell the company. COVID happened. That, obviously
Mhm.
delayed that process. I eventually did sell Workify in 2023. But in 2020 is when Daniel, who's my podcast co-host, he had been our first demand gen manager at Workify. He had left to pursue, bigger companies. And 3 months after he left, COVID hit, and he came back to me and said, "Hey, Steven, I think I made a terrible mistake." Um, I promptly told him no. Like, who could have predicted a global pandemic? And then he pitched me on the idea of MPL, and maybe someday you can interview Daniel. He can share with you, his origin story for the podcast. But for me, I knew that it was difficult. Like those were unprecedented times. I also knew that, we HR people had been working for, our entire careers. Um, and many times it's thankless. Like we don't, people don't understand all of the work. Employees don't understand all the work that goes into creating an amazing employee experience. And there's so many people, many from underserved groups, women, people of color, LGBTQ, managers that I have had in HR. I've been so blessed to have that. And I thought this, what a great way to pay it back, to give the future generation, what I had access to, but in a different way in this new kind of podcast format. Back in 2020, it was Wild Wild West. As you know, you've been doing this for a lot of years, Elena. So it was a lot easier back then. Well, I shouldn't use the word easy because it wasn't easy, but I think it was less crowded in 2020 to launch an HR podcast. And originally it was just like a side project. Like it was a way to give Daniel and I a little bit of enjoyment in our weeks. I was still running the startup, of course, and around 2022 we had found a buyer, and so I told Daniel, like, look, we need to formalize the business because I'm concerned that the private equity firm will claim that acquired my company will claim that this is part of the assets, and so we created all the LLCs. We created a monetization strategy for the podcast, and in 2023, Daniel went full time. I sold my business, closed that deal in April, stayed on for 6 months with the company, and then joined Daniel full time in 2024 last year. And I think most recently, to share a fun fact with me, I've become obsessed with all things AI for HR, and I've picked up things like vibe coding, and so I've told Daniel, like, I know that there's another chapter for me. I feel it in my bones. I don't know what that is exactly, but there's my journey's not over yet, and so yeah, I think that is the probably the long version of my story.
I love it. I mean, I'm just sitting, I'm listening to this, and I'm sure people who are listening to this podcast are feeling the same way. It's such a, what I love about asking that first question about like your career stories, because it showcases first, it's so, how to say, it was so, unplanned, let's say, right? So it's just like how you navigate the different opportunities that are available to you. And it's one of the things I always preach. I'm like, you have to, A, be aware, like, not be in tunnel vision all the time, be a little bit flexible of what might come your way. AK, in your case, just be, on the way to the airport, just having a conversation that opened up doors. And then also being able to pivot and take advantage of opportunities that are coming, regardless of, economic downturns, pandemic, and so on. And I appreciate the startup journey and not raising funds. With my first startup in 2019, we also kind of died down because we weren't able to raise those. We just couldn't compete in the VC kind of world. And now with ShiftWell, the startup now that's almost a year old. I definitely am taking all those learnings. So it's always nice to kind of hear that from other entrepreneurs, because it is like there's so much HR tech out there right now, and it's such a crowded market at the moment.
Mm.
And it's like, how do you, anyway, how do we, it's a whole separate conversation, but it was interesting because I'm in this world right now building. Anyway, but yeah, so I think it's super interesting. I love all the different transitions, and I'm excited to see what you're going to be building next, because I think you still have a lot to contribute and to and to kind of offer to the world. But talk to me a little bit more about the kind of modern people leader, and just like, what does that mean? What does it actually mean, and how is it different from the traditional leadership, I guess, perspectives?
That's a great question. Um, in the early days, Daniel and I, when we weren't as busy as we are now, we spent a lot of time just taking taking the conversations that we'd had with people leaders, and I guess a little for the listeners that have not heard of the modern people leader, I think we've recorded close to 300 episodes. We've had typically we're bringing CHROs onto the show. We've had CHROs from companies like Rivian, uh, LVMH, Goldman Sachs, PepsiCo. It's almost like a who's who of HR leaders at this point. So senior HR leaders, and the answer to your question for me, having interviewed 300 plus HR leaders, a modern people leader is innovative, is curious, is a lifelong learner. Today, I think a modern people leader looks different even to when we started the podcast in 2020. Today I think a modern people leader is examining things like artificial intelligence and what the future workplace will look like when we have humans and bots working together. I think a modern people leader is aware that the traditional the traditional model, traditional operating system that HR has used is is not meeting all the needs of the business. And I think, I go back to, you know, an episode that we have with Dave Ulrich. Dave is one of the godfathers of HR. He essentially invented the shared services HRBP model. And, he shared on the show, like, back in the late 80s in early to mid 90s, when he was sharing kind of his new concepts of the center of excellence model and the business partnership approach to human resources. Like, that was a very fitting approach, but as the needs of the organizations have grown, as change cycles have shortened, and even more so now with AI, those operating systems aren't keeping up with the pace at which things are changing. Employee sentiment, even that alone is changing much faster. And so I think a modern people leader understands this. They may not have been able to influence change at their organization, but they understand this and they're seeking out new ways. Um, I think modern people leaders are storytellers. They are business minded, and so they're business people first. That with a specialization in people and all things people and that's probably the number one differentiator that we've heard on the podcast, is that there's a like old school HR, which has a tendency of gravitating to the traditional definitions of HR: hiring, firing, retaining, um, and I think the a more modern take on that is like looking at the employee experience as the product of HR, and aligning like you would align a product with your business goals. Your product roadmap would be aligned with your business goals. We need to increase ARR, so we're going to build out the features that we are hearing from our customers that would help us renew accounts and expand accounts and bring on net new customers. And so if we apply that thinking to HR, I think a modern people leader is looking at the employee experience in a way that they are, understanding, okay, well, the customer here is the employee. And we're lucky to have so much data in HR, and a modern people leader is looking at what the data is saying, pulse survey data, maybe HubSpot or Salesforce data. They're combining all these things and they're aligning the changes, the goals in HR with the goals of the business. And so if we if we're not hitting our numbers for on the sales side, maybe we need to take a look at the our effectiveness in terms of onboarding salespeople. Maybe we need to look at which areas of the organization are doing the best job in maintaining talent density. And so those are, I know I'm kind of going off on tangents, but that alignment with that tight alignment with the business, I think is the number one hallmark of a modern people leader.
That kind of brings me to like, I feel like the natural way to take this, because you've also mentioned AI, and when I'm thinking innovation, when I'm thinking about, kind of just like how do we continue to help people grow, AI being a big topic, let's spend some time on that because that's a fun game to play, right? Like let's do fun predictions. So,
Love it. Yeah.
based on kind of the conversation you're having, I guess I'm curious, one is how much I guess HRO, CHROs or just the human resources people are ready for AI? What are they doing? Like, what are some, I guess, give me the optimistic outlook and then the other side maybe, because I think there's two sides to this, and I'd like to hear kind of both.
Well, first of all, I think, the best podcast guests are those that have a strong point of view and even better, spicy points of view. So I'll bring that for you. I'll offer my
Let's do it.
best spicy hot takes. So this is my personal thesis. These are my own beliefs and views, not those of the modern people leader or any any of our clients. But here's my take, Elena. I think that this AI thing is bigger than any of us really can imagine. I think that there won't be any part of a company that will not be impacted by Gen AI. And for the purposes of this conversation, we're talking about Gen AI.
Mm-hmm.
There's other AI, there's robots, there's AGI. Those are, I'm excluding all of those from the conversation, although, I maybe in another podcast I can share some thoughts on those. Um, and so this thing is going to be massive. I think this is like once in a generation type of change that is coming down the pipeline. Um, I believe that there is a massive upskilling and reskilling that needs to happen across the company. So this isn't an HR problem. This is a talent problem. I think that companies are, and again, I'm applying, broad statements across, lots of different organizations, which is a dangerous thing to do. But I think the bigger an organization is, the harder change management is. And I think even for small organizations right now, this change management for to accommodate AI and HR is very difficult. And I think that the longer you have been in business also makes it extremely difficult. And so I think it's really a tale of two conversations, Elena. I think when we talk to, high tech companies that are either AI first, meaning they were founded post March 2023 when ChatGPT dropped and then all the LLMs followed. Um, in that period, there's been a lot of things that have had to that companies have had to take into consideration, but it's been like drinking from a fire hose. And I think the reality is that since then, if you had the luxury of creating your company after that, it totally different. And that's the situation that the modern people leader is in. So if you go back to my story, in fall of 2022, I had signed a letter of intent to sell my company. um, I was working through closing in early 2023, call it winter spring. And that was the time where Daniel went full time into the modern people leader. And so we were while we had existed for years before ChatGPT dropped, we were creating the business like right as it was dropping. And so I believe that is a comparative advantage for companies that, could create the foundation of their organizations using Gen AI. It's a totally different ball game than a company that has let's use a podcast that has dozens or hundreds of employees that are all using systems that have processes in place that now have to be completely redone. And so all that to say, I think for the leaders of companies of these newer companies, I think they're like, what's the big deal? Like we're using AI. We've democratized an AI tech stack to all of our employees. We're building solutions in AI. We have agentic workflows. Like they're not perfect, but they're getting better. And so there's very high confidence and high progress for those organizations. For organizations that have been around for longer, that didn't have that blessing of being founded after ChatGPT dropped, which is the vast majority of the companies out there. They do have legacy processes. They do have legacy ways of doing business, and so the challenge is, how do you keep the lights on for all of those existing processes and building your widgets, and create space and time to learn these new tools, to begin to understand what the best use cases are for leveraging these new tools at your company, and then going through the process of piloting, getting feedback, building, testing, getting more feedback, and redeploying. And so the biggest challenges that we're hearing right now is around agility. Like we're not able to move fast enough. We still don't know how we're going to engage our all employees on this AI thing, or they have been more successful. And again, these are older established companies. They've been successful in some of the pieces, but they don't know where to take it from there. And the perfect example, and I won't name names, it's one of the businesses that has been very vocal in the press on LinkedIn about forcing AI employees to use AI. At our live event in New York a couple weeks ago, there were a couple of HR team members from this company, and they were like, we had this mandate. Our CEO posted it on LinkedIn, the all employee memo, and the goal was 100% employees using AI. But now, Stephen, we built all these tools that are half baked, that are like, maybe we didn't even need a custom chat GPT for this thing. And so HR is having to go back in and fix these tools. We're having to sift through hundreds of these things that people built because we asked them to, but now we're having to figure out what has lasting power and what doesn't. And so it's complicated. And I think that's the really kind of interesting, challenging thing for the modern people leader is, how can we meet with some people and they're like so far ahead, advanced when it comes to AI for HR and just the company in general. And then we have all these other HR leaders that we speak to that quite honestly are very, very early in the journey. And if this were a year ago, I wouldn't be as concerned, but a lot has changed in the last year. The models have gotten better. The automation capabilities are real and have gotten better. But yet here we are still having this kind of tale of two conversations.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I like that honest kind of perspective. I tend to think the same way. I do think we can't even predict what's going to happen with AI. I think we're not. I think collectively and like when we work with organizations, I'm like, it's really scary that people are not actually allocating teams to think about how it's going to impact their business, because there's still a lot of companies that are just not even, just kind of doing things as business as usual, and I think they're just going to get slapped with AI in the next 12 to 18 months in ways ways that we just can't even predict. But yeah, so it's
And if anything,
yeah,
sorry to
please.
interrupt, I
No,
think
please.
that it's like 3 to 6 months. I don't think this
Yeah,
is a 12 to 18 month timeline anymore. I think a year ago it was like, yeah, okay, 12 to
yeah,
18 months, we'll see what happens. Now I believe we're 1 or 2 quarters away from CEOs demanding like this is real. Jobs will be lost. There's
yeah.
no doubt in my mind. I don't know why we're not talking about it. Um, even the narrative on LinkedIn seems to want to avoid the fact that this is real. Like
Mm-hmm.
these tools are too powerful.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, listen, we're building an AI product. We're at the MVP stage right now, and every day I'm just blown like at the just the speed of evolution of these things, and I'm like, this is so scary, and like I'm on this like train where I'm like, okay, I'm on this train, and I'm trying to be one of those like people like actually built with this, right? Like I don't want to start 5 years from now; it's too late, right? Like, but I'm like. But at the same time, I see how scary it is. So, like, the other piece of me, I'm like, I just want to go live on an island and I just want to be like, I want to be away from these tools, But then part of me, I'm like, okay, well, I really think this is going to be really beneficial, like what we're building. So, it's like this continuous, tearing apart. And then to your point, when you think about companies that have these legacy, of years and systems and processes and huge teams, and it's like, where do you even start? Right. And so maybe that's a question, like, where, like, if you're a leader of these organizations, like, again, just
Yeah.
personal opinion, like where would you even start with that? And let's play
Yeah.
two things. So like one as a leader and also as an individual, like give me both. Like where would you start of trying to tackle this?
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is another great question. So, and my answer might differ a little to just because again I've half of my professional being is HR practitioner and half of my professional being is entrepreneur. The first thing I would do is I would sit down. I would probably, I've been hired, or this is coming to the forefront because there's a critical need to move forward. Um, I would sit down with the CEO and I would immediately have a hard talk with like how we got here. Like what the fuck is going on? Excuse my language. Like
Mhm.
how are we here 18 months later and or not even 18 months. What am I talking about? It was March 2023. We're
Mm.
now getting close to 3 years later. And how, organizationally, how do we get here? And I'm going to look at the Pulse survey data. I'm going to look at everything. But CEO, you tell me, why are we here? And how do you think, why is this important to this business? And, you know, what is at stake? And my guess is the CEO is going to say everything's at stake because we have competitors that weren't even on our radar, didn't even exist. And they are moving faster, they're shipping product, better. So that's where I would start. And that whole business centricity to me is everything. Because if not, what the heck are we doing? And so once I have that hard truth conversation, I would immediately make some important decisions. First, what is our AI stack? We you know, I would complete an audit of the tools that are available to us, the tools we're already paying for that are available to us, and I would identify, what I believe to be, a handful of critical productivity gains, like quick wins, low hanging fruit. Do we
Mhm.
have a note taker? Is everyone using it? Are these things mandated? Are these things democratized? Have we given, is every single employee at this company aware of the new tools that they can use? And mind you, it's probably a marketing. Most of the change that needs to happen is really a marketing exercise at the company, right? And so and so once I've democratized, we have a tech stack, I don't have to deal with IT and legal and compliance fighting about who's doing what, and I would get in again, the reason why I would engage the CEO is because you need to bring the CEO into the conversation because really the leadership team needs to be on board with this. Otherwise, it's gonna be blocker after blocker after blocker. And so having the CEO on board from the beginning, Once I have that, then I'm going to democratize. I'm going to define the AI tech stack that the company is using, and we're going to send communications out to every employees. And then I'm going to look at a big change event, a big cultural event, a cultural trigger of sorts to usher in the new AI era for the company. That could be a week long. Everyone stop your jobs. Everyone has a week to work in the new AI tech stack that we just shared, and with an end goal of 2 to 3 ideas on how AI can take over functions that humans shouldn't be doing, administrative functions. And I think from there, having this big cultural change event shows the company that we mean business. And there are other ways of doing it. I have heard of hackathons. I have heard of offsites. So every team will get an offsite budget. And in that offsite, it's a 2 to 3 day thing, and there's a format that we're going to create for all teams to follow. And so there's a lot of different ways to do it. We will choose whatever cultural change event would work best for the company, and from there, I'm immediately I would look at how we can create an AI lab within the HR team. And this is really, really important, Elena. The most successful brands that we have seen in terms of AI for HR, whether it was organic, intentional, or not intentional, somehow HR has become the AI lab for how AI projects are approached. And the reason for that, well, my hypothesis for that is there's so many administrative things that are not getting done well at all companies. That AI can do really, really well. I think the other reason for this is right now CFOs are scrutinizing everything within HR. This is not an employee friendly market still. It's an
Mhm.
employer driven market. And in these markets, budget is going to be impossible to come by. And because of that, it's a forcing function. Like HR, we're going to use these tools, and again, we're a data intensive function, and so we're going to look at like the employee experience, and we're going to look at points in that employee experience that are causing critical failures for the business. We're not hitting revenue targets. Costs are overrun. Like we need to reduce our costs to operate, whatever it may be. And guess what? Survey data is a great way to high level figure out like where these areas are. Within HR, there's some obvious ones. Just think open enrollment for benefits. Look at the number of tickets that your HR support desk gets every year around benefits questions. Calculate what those costs are to the business, and boom, you've got your first business case for an AI benefit spot, open enrollment benefit spot. That's just the first idea that came to head. Some other
Mm.
examples of what other companies have chosen as their first, performance. Uh, Performance requires so much time, administrative time for everyone involved. For the employees, doing a self assessment,
Mhm.
doing peer reviews, doing 360 reviews. For managers, having to re-summarize their own version of all these things, but yet they have to do it for 10, 20, 30 people. And so performance is a great candidate for reducing administrative time that people are spending on an important task, and actually making it better. I do believe that AI is already making performance a lot better. If you just think about recency bias and the way that these processes are managed. And so there are other use cases. And so that, after I've had the kind of cultural change trigger event, then I'm identifying, a short list of HR use cases for us to roll this out. And then I'm going to sell the CEO. I'm going to go back to what that original conversation was. And I'm going to say, Jim or Jane, we had this conversation. These were the problems we've talked about. This is how we've overcome it with HR. Let's use this as a blueprint in other areas of the organization. And then I would go into client success. I would go into sales. I would go into and maybe while I'm doing that, I'm also going back to IT and saying, "Hey, IT, look at what we just did." And I'm not only have we done this cool thing and we've used the tech stack that you approved, but we have a roadmap for how we can do this throughout the rest of the company. And you know what? 9 times out of 10, the IT team is going to be blown away, and they're going to realize that now they have change agents. Rather than having blockers, IT and HR have not been simpatico over the years, and I do believe in a future where we're not calling it HR tech, we're calling it workforce tech, and workforce tech is part of a broader portfolio of essentially an HR and IT organization that are either formally combined or are working much more closely together. And so, Elena, that would be my playbook. And then once you get to that stage, you've got we've reinforced that original conversation with the CEO with some quick wins. We have shown how change can happen by focusing on ourselves first within HR, and we've through that process brought IT closer, and they have now a vested interest, and I'm just going to ask for permission on where we go next, because any CEO would be crazy to not say, you know what, we need to do more of that. And
Mm.
so that essentially is reflective of the playbook that we're hearing companies use successfully. And these are
That-
companies like
mm.
Dropbox.
Mhm.
These are big organizations. New York Life, big insurance company. They have followed something similar. So
Mm. There were so many gems in there. Like, first of all, you should just like do a course, like share, like literally just break that into because I mean, there are so many practical takeaways. Like, just some of my favorite ones because it's what I'm thinking about as well is the HR become this AI lab because I feel like it's a natural place to kind of sit in the organization. I love the part about the audit. I think one of the things that we're solving is just like helping companies save money because I think there's a lot of tools that are just stale. People don't use them. They're not super applicable. That can be replaced with other AI tools. I think the performance piece is super important. And absolutely, we spend way too much time on performance. We don't do it well, and we definitely need to revamp the whole performance structure and how we do it across board. So there's just so many practical takeaways there. I'm now gonna just go ahead and on this podcast ask you for part two because I'm gonna need a part two of this podcast. Like it's just
you
there's
got it.
so much wealth of knowledge that you have, and it truly highlights your two sides, the HR practitioner and the entrepreneur, because you see things from so many different angles, and it's so practical. But as we kind of wrap this up, just talk to me a little bit about 60 seconds around your outlook for the future of work. Like, what do you see? What do you hope
Yeah.
to see?
Yeah. Wow, 60 seconds. Let's see how
Okay,
I
90
can.
seconds.
Okay. A couple of things I've already mentioned. I think we're going to see a convergence of HR and IT. And I think that not because that's naturally how things should, the order of things. The future is going to, we're at the very beginning of a lot of big problems that are going to, a lot of firsts, right? And, like when you have a child or you're married and you go through new firsts, it's always harder the first time you have to go through things. That's why change is so difficult in my mind. And so, once we get over these initial wave of problems, there's going to be more opportunity and there are going to be more problems. One of the problems that I see is who is going to determine the ratio of humans to bots? Who is going to
Mm,
determine the organizational design. There's a whole industry right now, OD, around how you design organizations that are that are right now comprised mainly of humans, right? What does OD for the future look like? And who is going to determine what that future design is? Is it going to be, an HR leader who has familiarity in human-centered design thinking, or is it going to be IT who are, essentially own the bots. And should they own the bots? Where do the bots belong? And so that this is why I believe and I'm a proponent for kind of this closer relationship between HR and IT. I think the
Mm,
reality is, HR doesn't understand all the technical nuances of some of the decisions that need to be made. But I can say, with a lot of conviction and confidence that IT doesn't have the skill set that is required to design the future organization. And so for me, that is why I spend a lot of time thinking about this, talking about this. You may or may not know because I haven't promoted it, but I've launched my own personal website, wheretonomics.com. If for those listening, if some of these things sound interesting, go check it out. I also I vibe coded the whole thing on my own, and so that's why I am so bullish on these technologies being used. And to wrap it up, because I'm over 90 seconds, I you
good.
know I think that when we think about the future, I worry a lot. I worry a lot about how these organizations are going to be designed. And again, I think we're entering the era of the technical CHRO. I think we've had
Mm,
compliance and people and business centric CHROs in the past. In the future, it's going to be more and more a technical minded CHRO.
mm. Yeah, it's a solid perspective, and I see how this is probably going to go that way. And I agree, IT is not the people to kind of take that. They just don't have that, and no, maybe nor should they, right? Like they don't have that skill set necessarily to take that organizational design further. But this is really, really interesting, Stephen. And I'm going to make sure to put your website and the podcast and everything in the show notes for people who are listening, because I think that just based on this conversation, you have, again, wealth of knowledge that I think we all need to tap into. And I am bringing you back to part two. And I knew you were going to be a great guest. So thank you for that. And thank you for making the time.
No problem. Thank you so much for giving me a platform to talk about things that I'm super passionate about.